Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening. I'm Catherine Wilhelm, Executive Director of the U.S. ASIL Law Institute, and this is our weekly ASIL Law Speaker Program. Today's program is called Sanctions and Human Rights, Lessons from Hong Kong. Before we get into it, I want to mention that 1 week from today, on Wednesday, October 27th, our guests will be Peter Dutton and Jonathan Odom, speaking about maritime conflict in East Asia. That program is called Testing the Boundaries, Conflict and Contest in the South China Sea. And that will be at our more frequent time slot of 9 a.m. I'm thrilled that today's topic has enabled us to finally have Carole Petersen as our speaker. And we also get to bring back our founder and director emeritus, Jerry Cohen, who will moderate and comment. As many of you know, Jerry is the Dean of Chinese Legal Studies at American Law Schools. He retired a year ago from NYU School of Law, but fortunately for us, he continues to work full-time on writing and public speaking, including leading programs for us and at the Council on Foreign Relations. Jerry, I know Hong Kong is where you began your career in China, and you pay very close attention to what is happening there now. So I hand the mic to you to introduce Carole and start our discussion.
Catherine, thanks very much. It's a great pleasure to have this program tonight. Every day we get new and more depressing news from Hong Kong. It's hard for those of us so far away to keep up with the details and the best analysis, but we do the best we can. But the ultimate question is, what is to be done about it, if anything? For Americans who always think there should be a solution to every problem, it's especially frustrating. And tonight we have a chance to update what's going on in Hong Kong and to consider efforts that have been made so far to react in an appropriate fashion by the United States and other liberal democracies to the discouraging developments in Hong Kong. Sanctions have been a principal content, you might say, of our reaction, and we have to evaluate that. And I'd like us to consider also, are there more effective, more appropriate things to do? We're very lucky tonight to have Carole Petersen with us. She knows as much about Hong Kong as any expert does. She taught at Hong Kong University Law School for roughly 17 years. She's been at the University of Hawaii for the last 15 years. In Hong Kong, she was the director of the Center for Comparative and Public Law. She knows the players and she follows things closely. And I'm sure those of you who heard her will agree she's a very articulate speaker. So, Carole, what I'd like you to do is talk for 15 or 20 minutes. I know you have a few slides. Then I'll ask a question or make a comment, and I hope Catherine will join us before we turn the discussion over to the rest of our audience. This should be a very interesting session. So, Carole, as we say in Chinese, Qing Zhao, please instruct us.
So I want to start by asking us to focus on what we mean when I say sanctions and why I'm not a big fan of punitive sanctions. Not everything that we do is a sanction. So simply commenting on China or Hong Kong's human rights record, that is not a sanction. It is also not interference in internal affairs, although Chinese diplomats like to use that phrase quite often. The truth is that when you join the United Nations, you agree to respect human rights and you agree to a certain monitoring process through the United Nations. And that is something China voluntarily agreed to. There's the Universal Periodic Review process. China has ratified many human rights treaties. They voluntarily agreed to be scrutinized by the international community. So that's not interference in internal affairs. I also want to make it clear that I think the United States and other nations have a perfect right to monitor China's compliance with the Sino-British Joint Declaration. And if for nothing else, to ascertain whether Hong Kong can still live up to its many bilateral agreements. Many people don't know this, but because the Sino-British Joint Declaration essentially promised that Hong Kong would have a separate common law legal system, many governments around the world relied upon that and have entered into bilateral agreements with Hong Kong, trade agreements, extradition agreements, all sorts of agreements. And they did so because the Joint Declaration, a binding treaty ratified by China and Great Britain and registered with the United Nations, that binding treaty made certain promises regarding the legal system. So it's not interference with internal affairs, and it's not a sanction to monitor whether that separate legal system is still functioning. And a lot of us have great doubts about that now. Countries may need to adjust their relations with Hong Kong. Many countries have, for example, suspended their extradition agreements or have stopped sharing certain sensitive technology with Hong Kong because they're concerned about whether the firewall between Hong Kong and mainland China is still there and whether Hong Kong's common law legal system is still reliable. So that's not a sanction. That's not what I'm talking about. It's also not a sanction to uphold our obligations under the Refugee Convention, which does obligate us to give safe haven to anyone who might leave Hong Kong as a result of political persecution. And I fully support giving safe haven to anyone who qualifies as a refugee and is seeking asylum. What I'm talking about today are more punitive sanctions. And these are the types of sanctions that governments have started putting on individuals, usually government officials, who we have deemed to be somehow responsible for violating human rights. All right. And so those restrictions are usually, they might be visa restrictions, they might be asset blocking restrictions. And although in theory, we're targeting just the individual, we are also involving financial institutions because they're told they can't deal with those people, right? And that's why if you follow the South China Morning Post, you know that Carrie Lam, the chief executive of Hong Kong, doesn't have a bank account anymore. And that makes a lot of people feel good. People are angry about what's happened. But I'm not so sure it's productive in the end. And so it's that kind of sanction that I'm really talking about today. Now, the second slide is just designed to give you where we started, the baseline. We started in 1992 with the US Hong Kong Policy Act, and that act was enacted in the United States during what we call the transition period between the ratification of the Sino-British Joint Declaration in 1985 and the actual transfer of sovereignty on July 1st, 1997. And during that transition period, there was, of course, a lot happening in Hong Kong. The Basic Law was being drafted. Drafts were published for public consultation. There was, of course, June 4th, 1989, which created a real crisis in Hong Kong-Beijing relations. But eventually, the Basic Law was enacted in 1990. And although it largely repeated the promises of the Joint Declaration, it did add some things that were not contemplated in the Joint Declaration. One is Article 23, which is the article that obligated Hong Kong to enact its own national security legislation. One is Article 158, which gave the power of interpreting the Basic Law, the primary power, to the NPC Standing Committee, and therefore gave China a great deal of power in deciding what the Basic Law really means. One of the big debates in the transition period was the whole question of democracy. And I hate to tell you this, people sometimes forget this, but not everybody in Hong Kong was actually so supportive of the campaign to institute local democracy in Hong Kong before 1997. Some in the business community were actually quite opposed to it. And I think that's something they may regret now, but those were positions that were taken in that transition period. And ultimately, the NPC Standing Committee's decision for the beginning of the special administrative region was only to have 1/3 of the members of the Legislative Council elected from what we call geographical constituencies. The rest were from an election committee or these functional constituencies, which are very undemocratic. Now, the reason I tell you that background is to remind you we knew that when we enacted the Hong Kong Policy Act. And the Hong Kong Policy Act in 1992 said we would continue to treat Hong Kong as a separate territory. We would support Hong Kong's membership in international organizations like the WTO, and give it access to sensitive technologies, et cetera. We said we will do this as long as Hong Kong is sufficiently autonomous, right? It didn't actually depend on Hong Kong achieving full democracy. All we did in that act was repeat the same phrase in the joint declaration, which was deliberately vague, that our legislature in Hong Kong would be constituted by elections. Didn't say anything about the chief executive being elected or about what those elections for LegCo would be like. And you probably know that in the transition period, there were huge fights at the end because Governor Patton, the last British governor, tried to make the functional constituencies more like geographic constituencies. Beijing didn't like it. They created a provisional legislative council instead for the transition. They undid all those reforms. So Hong Kong has been fighting about local democracy ever since. And of course, there have been other controversies that I won't go into because I want to focus on US policy. But in a nutshell, although the US has been watching, we really didn't make any major changes to our policy toward Hong Kong until 2019. And that was, of course, because of the anti-extradition protests. I think everybody agrees it was a colossal mistake by Carrie Lam to introduce that proposal. And in the beginning, the protest marches were what I would call traditional Hong Kong protest marches, completely peaceful, 100% peaceful. And unfortunately, even that 2 million march in June of 2019 did not persuade Carrie Lam to withdraw the bill. She was incredibly stubborn. And eventually violence did break out. And, you know, one of the pictures at the bottom of the slide was a common slogan that was scribbled that summer on billboards in Hong Kong. It was "You who taught us that peaceful marches are useless." And so the young people were saying, you would not respond to peaceful marches, so we're going to put more pressure on. The police also became much more hostile, not like they were when I lived in Hong Kong. When I lived in Hong Kong, I used to take my little boy to protest marches all the time, knowing that he would be absolutely safe because the police were polite. There was never even a window broken in those days. Things really escalated in the summer of 2019. And when I went to visit Hong Kong the last time was November 2019, and I was staying at Hong Kong U's campus for about 10 days. And all the things I was supposed to do were canceled because the students suddenly took over campus. And I have to say, I was shocked by the amount of property damage and also the naivete of the students who seemed to really think that they were going to be able to not only get rid of the extradition bill, but actually bring about full democracy in Hong Kong by what they were doing. And by that time, Carrie Lam actually had withdrawn the bill, very belatedly. But by that point, we had the 5 demands, right? They wanted much more. What we also started to see then were these US and UK flags. Even when they broke into LegCo in July, on July 1st, they actually were putting up British flags. This was extremely provocative, very unwise, particularly given the state of US-China relations in 2019, which were really bad. The one high point was in November 24th, when the district council elections were so pro-democracy. But in essence, that kind of spelled the end for democracy in Hong Kong as well, because Beijing saw how unpopular the government was. And Carrie Lam had been telling everyone that the silent majority supported her, but the silent majority did not vote for the pro-government policies. So meanwhile, what was happening in Washington? Well, I'm fast forwarding a little bit because this wasn't the first time Congress considered legislation. Various legislators had introduced versions of this bill before, but it was in September 2019 that the heat really started to be turned up. And the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act started to get a lot more support. In September, there were actually rallies in Hong Kong where people would ask the US government to pass this law, and they would wave American flags. And the Washington Post published an editorial in 2019 where they actually said that the protesters want the US to employ its considerable leverage over Mr. Xi and Lam to deter repression. And this editorial described the act that was being considered by Congress as the nuclear option, claiming that because so much of the foreign investment in China flows through Hong Kong, that Xi would be afraid to lose that separate status, right? Well, I think that was very naive. And the editorial not only overstated, I think, the leverage that the US had, it also accused the Trump administration of not responding adequately to the protests. So this kind of editorial put, I think, a fair amount of pressure on both Congress, but also the Trump administration. And on November 27th, the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act was passed. And all of a sudden, we see not just the joint declaration being referred to, but insistence by the US that Hong Kong achieve local democracy. We actually claimed in that piece of legislation that Hong Kong has to have a fully elected legislative council by 2020. Well, this was the end of 2019. We knew that wasn't going to happen. And so in essence, it was almost setting up a trap where the Trump administration would almost be obligated to withdraw the special status at some point. And for the first time, we started talking in this legislation about imposing sanctions on people who were violating human rights in Hong Kong. So some Hong Kong protesters thanked Congress for this legislation and sang the national anthem, et cetera. But I know a whole lot of other people in Hong Kong who were very worried about it, who said, this is bad. We are going to be trampled. We are stuck between this escalating conflict between Washington and Beijing, and Hong Kong is going to be the major victim. And of course, the Washington Post was wrong. Beijing was not the least bit deterred by this legislation. Instead, in January 2020, the hammer really came down. We got a new director of the liaison office who's much tougher, started talking about national security immediately when he arrived in Hong Kong. By May, the NPC had authorized this new national security law. It was enacted in June. Even before the people got to read the act, it was brought into force that night. People were arrested early on July 1st. And I think there probably would have been more arrests had it not been for COVID-19, because most people were off the streets by then. I won't go into everything that the law does. I think many of you are familiar with it. I'm happy to talk more about it later. And I've also published an article in the Hong Kong Law Journal called The Disappearing Firewall that describes it in more detail. When I published that article, I actually thought the worst thing about the law was going to be the new security institutions, which are now in Hong Kong operating. And one of the things that is very frightening about them is that they largely operate outside the scope of judicial review. The law actually excludes the right of the courts to review their operations. But lately, I've been thinking that I'm not even sure that Beijing's going to have to rely too much on those security institutions or on Article 55, which allows Beijing to assume jurisdiction over a case and actually take someone to the mainland for trial. The reason I'm not sure they're going to have to rely on them too much is that it seems like the Hong Kong government's being very enthusiastic about enforcing the law on its own. And they're also being very enthusiastic about using the provisions that reverse the presumption in favor of bail. So even though I do think eventually the appellate courts might interpret the law more strictly than the government is interpreting, a whole lot of people are going to be sitting in jail for years before they get their appeals because of the presumption against bail. So it's a very, very bad law and a bad change to Hong Kong's legal system. So then what did the United States do after that? Well, predictably, the Secretary of State reported in May already, even before the law was enforced, that Hong Kong was no longer sufficiently autonomous. The Hong Kong Autonomy Act was enacted in July 2020. It lists all the sins of Beijing all the way back to 1999. And I think some of them are really over the top and didn't need to be included. I'm not really sure. I think some of the statements are actually inaccurate. It was almost as if Congress wanted a really, really, really long law. But the more important provisions are those that endorse penalties for persons who are involved in not only violations of human rights, but any contravention of the obligations under the Joint Declaration or the Basic Law. Potentially quite broad scope. Anyone who materially contributes to reducing Hong Kong's autonomy could be sanctioned, although it's not that many people. I would say, I think it's in the low 40s have been sanctioned thus far. The executive order from President Trump announced essentially the end of differential treatment of Hong Kong, using his powers under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, not everything has been carried out that's in that act, but it announces the intention to end this differential treatment of Hong Kong. And if you go on the US Treasury's webpage now, you can find a web of Hong Kong related sanctions. It's good business for lawyers trying to figure out how the banks are going to comply with everything. Of course, again, China didn't hold back as a result of this. Instead, March 2021, China comes right in and overhauls the election system. Now only patriots can serve in governance in Hong Kong. And China's enacted its own anti-foreign sanctions law, although it's not clear yet whether it's going to be applied in Hong Kong. But I'm not even sure they need to, because it's a crime now in Hong Kong to even suggest that a government sanction the United States, sanction China or Hong Kong. So I don't see, frankly, any evidence that the sanctions, the punitive sanctions that the US has put on Hong Kong and China, these officials have had any mitigating effect. If anything, I think Carrie Lam kind of has a spring in her step again. She's looked upon in her circle as kind of a patriot. She's being sanctioned. She doesn't have a bank account. She's suffering for the nation. And to me, she seems to be really almost enjoying this new status. So I'm really not sure that it's helping. I'm also not sure that we can be so confident that this is going to have a huge effect on Hong Kong's business environment. Yes, there are some companies that are going to leave Hong Kong. There are some expatriates who will not want to live in Hong Kong anymore. But there are quite a few people in the business community who don't mind Hong Kong going back to being an apolitical place without a lot of protests. And so to the extent that we might have thought we had a whole lot of leverage, I think we might be in for a bit of a rude shock. And if you want to see how the Hong Kong government is playing out the sanctions now, take a look at this report they just recently issued, Hong Kong's business environment. It has a whole chapter on the United States and how we were the black hand behind all the protests and everything that has ever gone wrong in Hong Kong. But it also describes what a great place it will be to do business now that you don't have to worry about all those political disputes. So what are the lessons? Catherine and I went back and forth about my suggestions, and I confess it's kind of sad because it's more of a list of what we shouldn't do rather than what we can do, because I think our options are rather limited. But I came up with 5 things that I think are principles that should guide us in the future. One is I think we should be more careful not to raise unrealistic expectations. I really do think some of those protesters thought that Beijing would soften its approach if Congress passed that law in the fall of 2019. I saw students wearing Trump hats at some point when I was at Hong Kong U, and I remember asking them, what makes you think that Donald Trump is your friend? Well, he doesn't like Xi Jinping. Well, that doesn't mean he's going to help you, right? I think that we have to be more realistic with human rights advocates when they come knocking at Congress's door, suggesting that sanctions be implemented. Secondly, I think we have to recognize that sometimes sanctions can encourage an even more authoritarian response. And I can't honestly say that I know what would have happened if the US had taken a different approach, but I am certainly seeing China and the Hong Kong government use the sanctions as part of their narrative. They're now claiming that all the pro-democracy protesters were put up to this by the United States, that we were deliberately trying to destabilize Hong Kong to suppress China. And frankly, when you repeat that narrative enough, and if you look at some of the things that have been said in Congress, it becomes possible to justify in Carrie Lam's mind and in the minds of many of her supporters, not only the national security law, but also the whole overall of the election system in Hong Kong. Thirdly, I think we need to really focus on things that will provide practical help, like safe haven, rather than punishments. And some of the punishments in the executive order are really petty. I mean, for example, why did we terminate the Fulbright exchange program for both Hong Kong and China? I have a lot of friends at Hong Kong U who really are desperately trying to uphold academic freedom. And I don't see why we should prevent them or all the other academics who are trying to defend Hong Kong's academic freedom from participating in the Fulbright program. It could actually provide some support. Exchanges going both ways. We also required that Hong Kong goods be labeled made in China. And that is actually being challenged by the Hong Kong government using their right under the WTO, because they are still considered to be a separate jurisdiction, right? for a customs territory for the purposes of the WTO. Now, perhaps that isn't true anymore, but if we're going to challenge that, I think we should challenge that in the multilateral process, not just unilaterally say we're going to require your goods to be labeled made in China. It's just kind of petty and punitive, and makes a lot of people in Hong Kong feel quite badly. Fourthly, I think we should always have a sunset clause or some other clause so as to give the president some flexibility for future assessments and responses. We do know that the situation is very bleak. We know that. Democracy is basically over in Hong Kong as long as Xi Jinping is in power. There are a whole lot of people who are in jail who are essentially political prisoners now. But I still do believe that Hong Kong is different from mainland China. I don't agree with those people who say it's just like any other Chinese city. And I think that we need to take some time and see how the appellate courts deal with the appeals. The law does say that the ICCPR should be taken into account and it should be used as a guide to interpreting the NSL. I think that although the first case, the Tong Ying Kit case, the court did not do that, and I've published an online article critiquing that, but that case is being appealed and it's early days. And there is a difference between a soft authoritarian regime and a really hard authoritarian regime. And I think right now, Hong Kong is kind of in between somewhere, and it could go either way. So I think that we need to preserve at least some flexibility, rather than exercising all of these sanctions all at the beginning. And then 5, I think we need to support the UN human rights mechanisms. And this is my final slide. I know that a lot of people are disappointed in the UN Human Rights Council, but the truth is, it was a mistake for us to leave under the Trump administration. The Biden administration is re-engaged. We've now won a seat back on the Human Rights Council. And I think we should be there, very actively supporting the council and those liberal democracies that are trying to make it more effective. China will be going through the Universal Periodic Review process again in 2023, and it's an opportunity for the council to review and shed more light on what is happening in Hong Kong and other parts of China. In addition, underneath the council are operating all sorts of special mandates. These are independent experts, special rapporteurs, working groups, and they are not beholden to any government. And they have really been quite brave in criticizing China. I've just put a few quotes up. Every time China is criticized by them, the Chinese government hits back and accuses them of violating the code of conduct of the special procedures. Well, that's not true. They're doing exactly what they're supposed to do. And I think we should be there in the council, active to support these independent experts. And finally, we should pay close attention to Hong Kong's upcoming review by the Human Rights Committee, which is the treaty monitoring body, again, an independent body that monitors its compliance with the ICCPR. The Hong Kong government has just given its replies to the Human Rights Committee's list of issues, their questions for the review, and they're insisting that the ICCPR still applies in Hong Kong. They're insisting that there's still press freedom. They're insisting that there's still academic freedom. Well, in my opinion, if the courts don't start using the ICCPR as a guide to interpreting the vague language in the national security law, that's going to be a very hard claim to defend when Hong Kong is reviewed by the Human Rights Committee. But I do think there is some indication that the Hong Kong government wants to get at least a halfway decent review. I know they're going to get criticized very strongly by the Human Rights Committee. They're going to argue that the ICCPR allows restrictions on freedom of expression, et cetera, in the name of national security. And that's true, that is in the ICCPR. But the UN Human Rights Committee has been very clear in all of their interpretations that you cannot just assert that something is a matter of national security. And it has also been very clear that people should have a constitutional right to discuss constitutional change. So merely asking for democracy or asking for more autonomy or asking for at least internal self-determination should not be considered a threat to national security. So I think that that ICCPR review process may help a little bit, I hope, to give the Hong Kong government an incentive to be a little bit more reasonable in some of their prosecutions and some of their enforcement actions. I could be completely wrong, but I would like to hold that hope out because I do think that even though these human rights mechanisms, maybe they don't have the same bite as a sanction that tells Carrie Lam she has no bank account, but I think they might actually be a safer alternative for Hong Kong, so that Hong Kong is not caught in this sanctions war between the United States and Beijing. So I will stop there. I have a few other slides on other issues that I'm not going to show because I promised to finish within a half an hour. So I'm going to turn it over to Jerry for his comments now.
You've given us a truly remarkable portrait of what is taking place in Hong Kong. And you've helped us see the posture of the United States in recent years, and also the limits of UN efforts so far. So you've given us a variety of perspectives that I think is very useful. I've always been suspect of sanctions because it seems a little ridiculous to impose sanctions on a lot of these people who are henchmen, followers of Xi Jinping. We know in today's China, it's really one-man management. And the buck stops with Xi Jinping. Yet has anyone sought to impose sanctions on Xi Jinping? If he wanted to come to America, would we deny him a visa? What's the meaning of this? It seems a little phony and artificial to impose sanctions on people who are doing what the great dictator tells them. But what's your reaction to that, Carole?
Well, thank you, Jerry. And they never do. That's not the way these things work. They always avoid, and it's not just true of the United States, but other countries, they always avoid sanctioning the people at the very top. And that's partly because they want to continue to be able to engage in diplomacy, right? Just like you don't arrest the Secretary of State or the foreign minister, right? And so you're right, it does seem extremely ironic, right? And a little disingenuous, I suppose, to sanction people who are merely following orders, but in some cases very enthusiastically following orders. I don't really have a moral problem with denying Carrie Lam a bank account. My question is it effective? Does it do any good? And I noticed in the chat, Alvin asked a question about, my point about the narrative that the US is behind all of the unrest in Hong Kong. And he pointed out that some people have been saying that in Hong Kong for a long time. That's true, but they weren't getting much of a listen, right? That nobody was really buying the idea that the reason the people were out in the streets in Hong Kong was because of a US plot. But now they're actually, I actually hear people in Hong Kong say this on the radio all the time. And so I do think that the problem with these sanctions is not only is it sanctioning not the people who are making the decisions at the top, but also I think it actually antagonizes the relations at a time when we might be better off if we had a little better working relationship. And I'm not suggesting that Hong Kong would have become a democracy without sanctions. I don't think it would have. I'm simply saying that the truth of one country, two systems probably never was going to be local democracy for Hong Kong. I think the British knew that. They tried to get that in the joint declaration and they couldn't. And so they settled on very vague language. And it probably would have been more merciful if the Hong Kong people had simply been told that at the beginning instead of misled both by Maggie Thatcher and Deng Xiaoping. But I do think that there is room for Hong Kong to preserve at least some civil liberties. And I think that the protests of 2019, the resort to violence, the US Beijing relationship under Trump, which was so bad, I think it exacerbated the problem. I really do. I think it may have made the response even more authoritarian than it would have been.
Can we gracefully withdraw the sanctions? You point out we don't have a twilight provision. How would we get rid of them at this point?
It's a very good question. And I don't know that we can gracefully withdraw them because if you do, it's a big loss of face, and a lot of people who have lobbied for the sanctions will be, very unhappy. I think perhaps the only way it could be done, I mean, legally it could be done. President Biden had to extend the executive order this year, and he did so. It could be done legally. I think politically, the only way it could be done would be if the United States government was satisfied that the Hong Kong and Chinese governments had reconsidered, right, their application of the national security law and modified at least somewhat the way they're enforcing it. It's open to them to do that. I mean, one of the special mandate letters that just went out this month is basically asking them to do that. Perhaps one could stop, for example, refusing every bail application. I mean, it's ridiculous that people who are in jail and accused of subversion simply because they participated in a political primary are denied bail, because there are no more political primaries in Hong Kong anymore. So there's absolutely no chance of them continuing to threaten national security, which is the phrase in Article 42. Is it possible for the Hong Kong government to gracefully back off a little bit and not take full advantage of all the procedural advantages they have in the national security laws, so that they don't always oppose bail, so that they don't always oppose a jury trial, as they did in the Tong Ying Kit case? I think it would be possible. And I think if some sort of slight modification, gradual modification of the enforcement of the NSL were achieved, perhaps a president of the United States would find that it was politically acceptable to reduce some of the sanctions. At the end of the day, I suppose what you're hoping to achieve is that Hong Kong winds up being a little bit more like Singapore rather than a city in mainland China. And that's not what Hong Kong used to be. Hong Kong used to be a lot more free, but it might be the best that Hong Kong can get at this time. And it might take a lot of time to achieve that.
Of course, underlying your remarks is the old chestnut about whether you can have the rule of law and freedoms of expression in a society that is not democratically governed. The UK seemed to have done that in Hong Kong toward the end. Many of us who worked in China in the late 70s, early 80s, we thought perhaps that could happen. I don't think many of us thought that legal change was going to bring democracy to the Chinese people. But we did hope that maybe the improvement of legal institutions would make possible some protection against arbitrary repression, arbitrary detention, and maybe more regular court procedures, and possibly better judicial behavior despite continuing Communist Party control, which, as you know, was itself being debated among the party leaders in the 1980s before June 4th. So this is all part of the background. Maybe I think it's illusory to hope that Beijing is going to reconsider the national security law for Hong Kong, but it might be possible if US-China relations do improve now, where we at least have civilized and sometimes creative contributions made by both sides, whether on environment or on many other issues that need the cooperation of both countries. It might be possible in that context for Biden simply to let them expire. I don't know whether he has to issue an executive order that would officially and literally terminate the sanctions. Right now, he seems so worried about American public opinion before next year's congressional election, when the country is so deeply divided. One of the few things, as you know, we're united about seems to be his hostility toward China. But if he can move cautiously and effectively toward a reconciliation of a modest nature with China, that might be the context for letting these sanctions die. In the meantime, would we take other steps that would increase hostility? I have been beating the drums for some time that we should enhance prospects for people who want to leave Hong Kong to come to the United States, and not only ease the bureaucratic procedural barriers, etc., but to provide financial aid for those who need it, etc. But of course, that kind of gesture, it might be more effective than sanctions, but it proves effective, might be more offensive to Beijing. What do you think about that?
As I said before, I do support safe haven. And I think there are quite a few people, not only from Hong Kong, but from other parts of China, who in theory have very strong asylum claims, who are still kind of waiting to be officially given status in the US. And I think that is something the United States should be doing for all asylum seekers, is to put the money and the resources in to make sure that we honor our obligations under the Refugee Convention. As to whether that would irritate China, I mean, obviously the Chinese government was very irritated by the UK's decision with respect to the BNO passport holders. But in the long run, I'm not so sure that Beijing cares that much if people leave Hong Kong. I mean, I've heard US legislators make this comment that we'll show Beijing all the smart people are going to leave Hong Kong and come to the United States, and they'll be deprived of all this talent. I'm not so sure that's going to bother Beijing so much, because frankly, they have a lot of very smart, talented people in mainland China who'd be very happy to move to Hong Kong. And it may not be the same Hong Kong that you and I loved, but it won't necessarily be a failed economy either. So whether or not a lot making it easier for people to come to the US would irritate Beijing, I'm honestly not sure. I think a lot depends on how it's done as well. If it's done in a way that is designed to just promote people's opportunities, that's one thing. If it's done in a way where you're trying to assert this as some kind of punishment against Beijing, that's probably not the most diplomatic way to do it. And if you do want to ease the relationship between Washington and Beijing, I think we do need better diplomatic skills than we had under the Trump administration. I want to go back, though, Jerry, to something you said about freedom of expression and democracy. Certainly, the British did allow freedom of expression in Hong Kong, certainly in the latter years, despite the fact that they did not have full democracy or really anything approaching it, because the first directly elected legislators were not even elected until 1991. So I think it is possible, but it takes a lot of self-restraint by the government. And the concept of freedom of expression in the UK is very different than the concept of freedom of expression in mainland China. And it has become even more repressive, obviously, under Xi Jinping. So things that might have been tolerated under previous leadership in China simply won't be tolerated now. I think the question is, could one reach a stage where Hong Kong people know that there are certain bright lines you can't cross? You cannot stand up and advocate independence anymore. If you do that, you're going to be prosecuted. And I think that the courts will enforce that. That does violate the UN Human Rights Committee's interpretation of the ICCPR, but it is also a bright line that Hong Kong people could probably adjust to and still feel that they could live a good life in Hong Kong. Not everybody feels they have to have quite as much freedom of expression as we have in the United States. The flag desecration law, for example, in the United States, we think the right to desecrate the flag is a constitutional right. That's what our Supreme Court says. But a whole lot of democratic countries do have laws criminalizing flag desecration. It's possible to live in a country and have a good life and have academic freedom without necessarily desecrating the flag as a form of protest. So I guess I think the point I'm trying to make is that sometimes as Americans, we tend to think that the only way to enjoy civil liberties is the American model. And in fact, we are kind of an outlier when it comes to freedom of expression. We protect freedom of expression more than any country in the world. Sometimes I think a little too much. We don't have laws criminalizing racial hatred speech, for example. Many democratic countries do. So for me, I think what I'm trying to get people to think about is that it isn't just, is Hong Kong free? Is Hong Kong not free? It's the best it's ever going to be is going to be somewhere in the middle. And I think there is value in trying to find a way to bring the temperature down a little bit in terms of international relations, because I do think Hong Kong is suffering as a result. I think the crackdown was even harsher because of the extreme tensions between the Trump administration and Beijing. And I don't know how much easier it might have been, but I do think if the protests hadn't gotten as violent as they did, and frankly, they did get violent, there's no denying it. I think a lot of people fail to acknowledge that things did become very, very rough and tough in Hong Kong in that last month. The campus that I was on, Hong Kong U, was relatively peaceful, but I did see young students piling bricks up 10 stories above the entrance to the campus. And when asked what they were going to do with those bricks, because the police were standing at the gates down below, it was pretty clear they were prepared to push them off, and they could have killed people. And if a child had been crossing the street at the time, they could have killed children. It didn't happen at Hong Kong U. And I think one of the reasons it didn't is some very, very brave deans came out, frankly, and negotiated between the students and the police. And they went up and down the stairs, because the elevators were all broken, to talk to the police and to say, please don't come in, because the students say they won't do anything bad if you don't come in. And the students, and then they persuaded the students, don't push any bricks off the wall. The police have promised not to come in. But, that was a very volatile situation. And I think sometimes those of us who are lobbying Congress or writing articles for the Washington Post might forget that these are very young people, very inexperienced, very emotional. I saw students just burst into tears because they wanted democracy so badly. But they had a very naive idea about what they could accomplish by ripping up the bricks all over Hong Kong U. And in the end, a whole lot of young people went to jail well before the national security law was passed. They went to jail because they were committing acts of violence and damaging property and doing things that were unlawful. And I hate to say it, but I do think that the US politicians could have been a little stronger about urging people to remain peaceful. And I feel the same way about a lot of people in the pro-democracy movement in Hong Kong. I know there was this sense of, we don't want to cut them out, we don't want to break ranks. But frankly, when you see young people doing things that are very, very dangerous and can hurt innocent people and could wind up throwing their own lives away in prison, I think you have an obligation to speak out, and speak out in very strong terms. And I don't think that was done. I think that was a missed opportunity.
I don't disagree with what you said, but I don't want to leave people with the impression that the line on speech is being drawn with respect to sorry, it's my son calling. I don't want to leave people with the impression that it's only a denial of the free speech to say we want independence. What we have seen is an extreme application in recent weeks of a rule that says you can't say anything. Can you really now say we should amend the national security law, as some have sought to do? It seems that almost any symbol of free expression is gone now, and people are frightened to death. And the reason they're frightened is arbitrary detention. The ability to lock people up now for years, as you point out, has been riveting on the Hong Kong population. I read the other day an interesting article by Professor Lau Shou Kai, a distinguished sociologist who's very pro-Beijing. And he said, well, it's natural that since the national security law has come in, people in Hong Kong have reverted to their traditional conservatism. It's true there were 2 million people in the streets protesting what Beijing was doing, but that wasn't the real Hong Kong. Now we see the real Hong Kong has reasserted itself, but he doesn't give much adequate attention to Hong Kong people are indeed very practical. They don't want to go to jail. And they know if you open your mouth or you do something in any public way, you're going to go to jail, even if someday the courts might vindicate your defense. And I think we shouldn't underestimate how narrow the line is for continuing speech today and how severe the punishments are. And that's the real story, I think, why Hong Kong people are quiet since the national security law. It's kind of the silence of the graveyard. And it's wonderful. I used to live near a graveyard when I went to Yale Law School as a student. And it was a very quiet place to study. But I didn't want to live there.
Okay, I would like to jump in at this point, if I may,
Please.
and start to introduce some of the questions from the audience, because
Good.
we have a number of very good questions here. The first, I'd like to pair two of them, ask them together. So Martin Flaherty says, is there a space between unilateral US action and UN human rights mechanisms? For example, coordinated multilateral pressure involving the US, EU, and perhaps non-Western states. So that's a kind of probing a little bit on, exactly how can the multilateral approach that you suggested, Carole, how could that work? And then relatedly, bring it up at the same time, Joshua Rosenzweig asks, if we take your point about the UN human rights mechanisms seriously, is there more than engaging, puts in quotes, that the US and others can do there? Because signs point to China's influence over those institutions growing. So let's take those two first.
Do you want me to start with that? I'm going to answer the second one first. Yes, there's more that we can do than just engage more. Specifically, first of all, we should ratify more treaties. We've ratified fewer human rights treaties than China, which is a little embarrassing because it's so difficult to get 2/3 ratification. But more immediately, one of the things that China is trying to do is trying to make it much easier to suppress NGO reports. And of course, from Hong Kong, there always were many NGO reports coming. Now I think we're going to see fewer because I think Jerry's point is a good one. People are really scared, but you are going to still see some, and you're going to see a lot of international NGO reports. China's always trying to get them taken down off the website and to be disregarded. And I think that's something that we really have to defend. And if you ratify more human rights treaties, you get a seat at the table at the Conference of State Parties. But the US, we've been so reluctant to get involved in that. And partly because there are a lot of conservatives in the US that don't like them when we get criticized by the UN human rights treaty bodies. So I think if we engage more and give support to the countries and the NGOs that are trying to make the human rights system more effective, or at least not become less effective, that would be helpful. I really do think so. To the question about, is there space? Yes, I agree. I do think that multilateral efforts are more effective. It's harder for the Carrie Lam government or Beijing to dismiss criticism or other actions as just part of the US effort to suppress China if it is a multilateral effort. And one of the interesting venues is the WTO. As I said before, Hong Kong is challenging the Trump administration's claim that all goods from Hong Kong should be labeled made in China. And the US initially, our response was, oh, this isn't suitable for WTO dispute resolution because it's a matter of US national security, which I thought was really funny, because one of the things we're claiming about the national security law is that, it over defines what is a threat to national security. I think we should embrace that dispute resolution process. I think it's time for the WTO to actually consider, is Hong Kong still a separate customs territory? Should it be deemed that? Or is it in fact that the customs officials are just taking their orders from Beijing? And if they are, then Hong Kong shouldn't be a member of the WTO anymore. That is a multilateral process. Now that process, I think, would give the Hong Kong and China and Beijing governments a moment to think about, well, what can we do maybe to try to prove to the WTO that Hong Kong is still a respectable common law legal system with a separate customs territory. So that's just one example, but I think that there are other ways that maybe multilateral or efforts can not undo the national security law. I'm not naive. I mean, it's there and it's bad, but maybe to mitigate a little bit some of the effects of it.
Jerry, did you want to add anything to that?
Well, I'm very skeptical, of course, that for the reasons we just heard articulated, anything in the UN that involves the UN institutions of human rights can be very effective against China. We have to ask, what does a Human Rights Committee review amount to? And in the past, to what extent hasn't China managed to frustrate much of the effectiveness of the Human Rights Committee's action? And I wonder whether there'll be access to our special rapporteurs to Hong Kong, as well as the mainland. They've been denied access for so many years. And whenever one of them experts does get in, he usually blasts the Chinese government justifiably, which doesn't allow any others to go. So I'm a little concerned about the efficacy of more UN action because the US, as has been noted, is really on the defensive with respect to controlling various organizations that it used to have profound influence over. And I wonder, apropos the WTO, have we stopped blocking the arbitration process in the WTO? That has been one of the most embarrassing US actions, which has inhibited effective WTO response to problems.
So let me tee up two more that have, at least in my mind, are somewhat related questions. One of them is asking whether it's actually too soon to say that the sanctions have failed because they haven't been enforced all that long, and could in future have some effect. And then an opposite direction comment on the sanctions saying, well, effectively, of course they didn't work because Beijing has learned over time that there are never any costs to its bad behavior. So Beijing would assume that the sanctions are also kind of empty talk. Thoughts about those two?
Well, but they're right. They're empty talk. I mean, the truth is, when you just sanction a bunch of officials and they lose their bank accounts in Hong Kong, they probably get a raise from Beijing and a lot of pat on the back. So the question is, what would you do? And I think one really has to sit back and think about that, because what was so naive about that Washington Post editorial in September 2019 is it really seems to think the US has a huge amount of economic leverage over China. And, that's just not so true anymore. And I think we just have to recognize that. So if your economic superiority that, you used to feel was so influential is waning, then what else do you do? We have to really think carefully about the repercussions for people if you take even more serious actions. And as to the question about maybe the sanctions just haven't been there long enough, the sanctions that we have put on Hong Kong officials and mainland Chinese officials, that I don't think they're going to have any more positive effect 10 years from now than now if they're still in force. I really don't. I don't think Carrie Lam's going to wake up one day and say, oh, I really do miss my bank account. I'm not going to enforce the national security law so strictly anymore. And if she did wake up and say that, she'd have to resign, because then she would no longer have the patronage of Beijing. I mean, I think Albert Chen wrote a really interesting article not too long ago where he talked about the political patronage in Hong Kong. I mean, the sad thing about the situation in Hong Kong is that because the government has so little support, they're just appointed, they don't have that much political support in Hong Kong, they become completely dependent on the political patronage of people from Beijing, and therefore completely answerable to them. And that happened really even before January 2020, but even more so now. And if I can just answer one more question, as I saw it in the chat, Tom Kellig asked, isn't Carrie Lam equally unpopular with the pro-Beijing people? And you're right. I mean, the pro-Beijing, the DAB, they don't particularly love Carrie Lam either. But I think we have to be careful if we're hoping that she's going to leave, and she might not be reappointed, but who are you going to get in place? I mean, I certainly don't want to see CY Leung come back. He was much scarier, in my opinion. I think he single-handedly created the independence movement in Hong Kong. He just started talking about it nonstop. And before you knew it, there were people talking about independence, which they never were before. I think he deliberately created that paper tiger in the hopes that he could show Beijing, you need a tough man like me. And it didn't work to get him reappointed at that time, but there's a possibility he could be chief executive again. So as much as I dislike Carrie Lam, I'm worried that the next one might be even worse. So
I think we shouldn't underestimate the influence Beijing now has on events in Hong Kong. We shouldn't constantly reiterate Hong Kong government can do this or Carrie Lam can do that, because I think she and her government have lost much of the power to do anything. As Carole said at the outset, you have under the NSL, the National Security Law, put in place at every stage of the Hong Kong sanctioning process, people from the mainland who are specialists from the Ministry of Public Security and Ministry of State Security. They now tell the Hong Kong government what to do, and they do it through the various institutional arrangements established by the law. And the director of public prosecutions himself in Hong Kong found himself isolated and excluded from the process of who would bring national security prosecutions in Hong Kong. Beijing is running the show now, and we have to talk about that. And Hong Kong government, I think, is becoming increasingly insignificant.
Well, the argument that you're making, Carole, both now and also in your Usali Perspectives essay that we published this morning, is that sanctions don't work as a tool. And I wonder if the problem is the tool itself, or is it how the tool is used, when it's used, the circumstances under which it's used. So Alvin Chung has posted a number of questions in the queue you may have seen, asking about why Western governments, including the US, ignored the growing tensions in Hong Kong, the rising unhappiness in Hong Kong, and slowly escalating Beijing interference for years. I think in one of his questions, he spoke of a decade, but well, basically since the umbrella movement. Do you think that the tool of sanctions might have been more effective if it had been used earlier at a different phase in this, as opposed to when it was finally brought in? You know, if we're going to use Hong Kong as the test case to try to understand how do sanctions work, do they ever work?
yeah, I mean, I think it should have been used in 1972 when China first demanded that Hong Kong and Macau be taken off the list of non-self-governing territories. That was wrong. I mean, the Hong Kong people should have been asked. There were 4 million people living in Hong Kong at that time, and Hong Kong had been on the list for a quarter of a century, and yet they were just taken off. And the UK deserves some of the responsibility for that as well, because the UK could have objected in the General Assembly and it didn't. And so, yes, the further you go back, the more leverage the US would have had with, I think, in that respect. And so to answer Alvin's question, yes, probably it would have perhaps had more impact. But I do think we have to remember what was set up in the joint declaration was an asymmetrical power relationship. Even if China complied with everything in the joint declaration, they reserved the right to do whatever they wanted 50 years later. And so the real sin, if you ask me, was 1972 and not giving the people of Hong Kong the right to choose. And I do want to, sorry, go ahead, Jerry.
Yeah, at that time, 1972, Ambassador Huang Hua, who was the permanent representative of Beijing in the UN, he made a remarkable statement when some people said, how can you deny the people of Hong Kong the right to debate their future? And he said, Chinese do not have to vote to make it clear that they're Chinese.
Yeah, there you go. And if I may, I just want to answer one question because it's quite specific. Phil Chan asked a couple of good questions. One, I just want to correct, I'm not saying the Hong Kong people as a whole are naive. What I was saying is that I think some of the students I spoke with in Hong Kong when I went back were very naive about what they were likely to achieve. And I do think that articles like that in the Washington Post encouraged that. They encouraged the belief that somehow if you got the attention of the US government and it sanctioned or threatened to withdraw the special status that Hong Kong had in US law, that somehow Beijing was going to completely change. I think that was naive. It's not naive to want democracy. There's nothing naive about that, but that particular strategy at that particular time. And the other question that Phil asked had to do with the Court of Final Appeals view of the ICCPR and the relationship with the national security law. I'm not saying that the Court of Final Appeal is likely to declare anything in the national security law to be unconstitutional. I think the Court of Final Appeal has made that quite clear, that in their minds, the NPC Standing Committee has the right to adopt this law and put on an Annex 3, even though they barely even talked to the Basic Law Committee about it. But they have the power to do that. And the Court of Final Appeal, I don't think, is going to question the constitutionality. The point I'm trying to make is that I think the Court of Final Appeal has also clearly said in the Jimmy Lai bail application case that Article 4 of the national security law means that if there's any vague language in the national security law, and there's a lot of vague language in the national security law, it should be interpreted to the extent possible so as to comply with the basic law and the ICCPR. And that is what I think the trial court did not do in the Tong Ying Kit case. They don't even mention the ICCPR. And clearly his flying the banner behind his motorcycle was political speech. They should have at least considered whether their interpretation of the elements of the offense of incitement to secession complies with the ICCPR. And I am still hopeful, and I know I'm perhaps unduly optimistic, but I am still hopeful that the appellate courts will do a better job. And I think it's crucially important because incitement to secession is one of the most frequently alleged offenses. They're not trying to actually allege secession itself because they know that nobody's actually taking actions to push for secession. They're not writing a constitution or forming an army or doing anything to actually fight for independence. The most people might be doing is talking about it. And so what it means to incite secession in an environment where it's pretty impossible to achieve it is, I think, a matter of interpretation. And the court agreed that there was a disagreement between the prosecution and the defense on what the elements of this offense should be. And I think they should have referred to the ICCPR. Whether or not the appellate courts will do, I don't know.
Will the foreign non-permanent judges on the Court of Final Appeal have a significant influence on the court's determination of this issue?
I hope so. I mean, the whole point of having a non-permanent judge from overseas on the Court of Final Appeal was to make sure that they would be influenced to the extent you wouldn't want to have a judgment where you just had one dissenting judgment and it was from the foreign judge, right? So I think that there may be some influence, but I honestly don't know. And it's kind of like asking, can Chief Justice Roberts influence the conservative wing of the US Supreme Court? I don't know, because we don't really know what goes on in those judicial discussions. But you've raised another interesting question, Jerry. I mean, should the foreign judges continue to participate? Some think they shouldn't. Some think they should still be there. I personally would rather have them there than not, but I can fully understand why some judges might say, no, I can't be a part of this anymore. But once again, I think that we still don't know exactly how the Court of Final Appeal will navigate this territory. And I sure don't envy them that position, because I'm sure they know in the back of their minds that if they adopt too liberal an interpretation of a vague provision in the national security law, they risk a reinterpretation by the NPC Standing Committee, which has the overriding power to interpret the national security law, as well as the basic law. So it's a bad situation. There's no question about it. It's a really bad situation. And I think that's the point I guess I've been trying to make, is that all along, Hong Kong needed to be able to show Beijing why it was in Beijing's interest to allow Hong Kong to have more civil liberties, more freedom of action than is allowed in the rest of the country. And that's why just getting the approval of the US Congress doesn't really get you anywhere, unless the US Congress has more leverage than it does. And I don't think it does have that much leverage right now.
There are foreign judges on the lower courts in Hong Kong, in the appellate courts between the highest court, the Court of Final Appeal, and the magistrates and the district court. Can we expect them to be taking part in some of these important decisions? To what extent are the judicial arrangements in Hong Kong, whether below the CFA or in the CFA, allowing foreign judges to have a significant input? So I think it's an important question.
Well, yes, and I think also you have to clarify what you mean by foreign judge. There are a lot of non-Chinese judges in Hong Kong who are lifelong residents of Hong Kong, maybe have been there for generations, who are permanent residents of Hong Kong. I don't consider them to be foreign. I'm not sure if that's what you mean. There are also a lot of excellent Chinese judges who I think will do their best to try to interpret the law in a way that preserves the right to fair trial and at least a minimum level of civil liberties. I don't know. The judges are in a very, very difficult position.
Yeah.
I think the judges in the Tong Ying Kit case, though, didn't even try. And I don't really understand that. I wasn't there during the trial. I know that the defense lawyers did not make a constitutional challenge. And I'm not surprised that they didn't. But I would have assumed they would have been, and I know that they argued for a different interpretation of the elements of the offense of incitement. And it seems to me that the 3-judge panel just ignored that and they cited all these really old British cases on incitement that are all either before the European Convention on Human Rights or dealt with speech that wasn't at all political speech. And so I think it should be pretty easy to make a good argument on appeal that they did not take the appropriate approach to interpreting the incitement to secession offense and the elements of offense, that they didn't interpret in a way that preserves at least some compliance with the ICCPR. But I think other judges will try harder, I do.
I hope that the appellate judges will read your excellent critique of the lower court opinion.
I hope so as well. And by the way, I think the Hong Kong Law Journal is still publishing some very fine critique. I mean, I wrote down this question about, can you still lobby for amendments to the national security law? I think there are academics in Hong Kong who are doing that, but I will check to be sure.
What is the timetable on the appeal in the Tong Ying Kit cases? When could we expect there to be movement on that? And is there a deadline by which that must be heard?
I know that they have filed the appeal. I don't know anything beyond that. I don't know. Things move very slowly in Hong Kong. So I'm honestly not sure. Maybe someone in the chat might know.
Okay. So Tong Biao is pushing back on the argument that sanctions don't work. He says sanctioning, for example, the Magnitsky Act is one of the few leverages democratic countries have to give pressure to Beijing. All Chinese top officials have huge property in the US and Western countries, and naming and shaming is important too. Now, I don't know if he intends this, but the last comment, but I guess I could understand that to be just, even if there isn't an actual economic impact, the fact of the moral statement or the moral impact of the sanction needs to be done, regardless if there's no effect at all, which is another argument in favor of sanctions. It doesn't function like a physical lever, but it is a moral statement that needs to be made.
I mean, I totally support naming and shaming. I just think the more punitive measures, I'm not sure that they really help. The point about property, yes, it's a fair point. And I'm sure there are some officials who might try to get out of certain positions. I mean, to the extent you might get people resigning in some situations, maybe it has an effect. Seems to me that they always manage to find somebody else to carry out what was going to be done, right? I mean, we did see, for example, the head prosecutor in Hong Kong just resigned before even the enforcement happened. I don't think he did it out of fear that he was going to be sanctioned. I think he probably did it out of his own because of his own moral compass, I suspect. But to the extent maybe the sanctions do have a higher naming and shaming value than just critiquing, perhaps that's true. It might be hard to imagine.
Well, if we say sanctions don't work, and we talked a little bit, you just talked about, collective action, joining hands with other like-minded countries and so on, but what does some alternative to sanctions really look like? Are we talking about intensive diplomacy? Are we talking about, backstage conversations and arm twisting that is possibly coercive in nature, but it's just not made public so as to be more effective? In other words, the quiet coercion that Beijing might feel, it could accept because nobody will know about it except them. What is it that we should be asking our elected officials to be doing now if we accept that sanctions don't work?
Well, it's difficult because first of all, our sanctions policy isn't really a policy because we have all these different legislators who want to introduce bills, right? One crazy congressman actually introduced a bill saying the United States should recognize Hong Kong as an independent country. Obviously, it didn't go anywhere, but that's how crazy this sort of thing can get. At the end of the day, it comes down to the White House to determine through executive orders and whatnot how they're going to implement the sense of Congress as they express it. I mean, I wish I could give you some magic key that I think would work better. I do think that sometimes holding back a little bit and having something left to do later is more strategic than throwing everything in the bucket all at once. And I sort of feel that that's what the Trump administration wanted to do. That's what I mean about ending the Fulbright program and the labeling. It just seems like just add on more and more and more so that they could say credibly, we're really hurting China. And as you say, it's the one real bipartisan issue in the United States right now. I'd
like to see President Biden make a speech where he could indict China for what it's doing in Hong Kong and maybe summon the kind of moral and other support that would make it possible to de-emphasize the importance of sanctions. What we need is I like Tong Dao's point about we have to engage in symbols to demonstrate why we're so opposed to what's happening in Hong Kong. And a presidential speech would be a great way to do it, much more impressive than sanctions. But of course, he's got to do it in light of the fact our own house is not in order.
Yes, I think that's what I mean about ratifying more human rights treaties. The United States is not good when it comes to that record. I did notice one comment. Someone said it sounds like you're blaming the victims. I'm not trying to blame the victims. I do want to make that clear. But when you're in a situation where you really don't have much power, there's a value in thinking strategically. I mean, it's a little bit like my father used to tell me. I grew up in a very rural area. We did a lot of hiking, a lot of camping, and it was always, if a grizzly bear runs in and messes up your campsite, don't run up and stick your penknife in the grizzly bear. Maybe it makes you feel better for a moment, but in the end, you really have to think about, is it going to be even worse? And I did meet with a lot. I've been going back to, until COVID hit, I was going back to Hong Kong 3-4 times a year. And I have spoken with a lot of students who would always say to me, this is the absolute worst. It can't get any worse. And it can get a lot worse. It actually can get much, much worse. And that was in 2014, 2015. It's a sad situation. And that's why I go back to 1972. It's been a sad situation for a very long time. And I hate to say it, but the United States and the UK, we also tend to put our own personal interests, our own national interests first. And I think that had a lot to do with why there wasn't more vocal support for Hong Kong's right to self-determination a very long time ago. Right? It is a very, very bad situation. And somebody else asked in the chat, so you're saying Hong Kong people can have a happy life under the NSL. I don't know. It depends on the individual. I do know that there are people in Hong Kong who are getting ready to leave because this is not the Hong Kong that they know and love. And so they're going to leave. I know other people in Hong Kong who are trying to find a space to see if they can still lead meaningful lives where they're doing good work for people and various areas. There are other areas of human rights, economic, social, and cultural rights, access to housing, discrimination, where a lot of my friends are waiting to see, can we still do good work and lead fulfilling lives and maybe live here in Hong Kong for the day when there might be a little bit more space. Albert Chen.
Education of the children is proving to be a powerful incentive for people who otherwise could live and do business successfully in Hong Kong to think about leaving. Many people who could lead the kind of lives that people lead in Shanghai and Guangzhou and Beijing, just keep your nose clear of politics, can have happy lives despite everything in Hong Kong, but they worry about their children. And look what Beijing is doing to the education of Hong Kong, from the lowest grades to the university level.
So I just want to point out, Alvin Chung tells us the judges below the CFA are not foreign, they are Hong Kong permanent residents. Thank you, Alvin. And a comment from Yujie Chen saying sanctions do work, but they have to be targeted and the timeline has to be long with sustaining pressure. See South Africa. So I do want to push back on this line that sanctions don't work, but Carole is right that there are other ways to sanction. And then in our remaining few minutes, just want to get to the question that Phil Chan and someone else raised about the universities, Carole, because you did speak of wanting to support people at the universities who are still trying to find space and, as you say, do good work. So what sorts of support do you have in mind? How can American academics, or anybody for that matter, support Hong Kong academics?
Very good question. And yeah, in my essay, I actually put a link to the welcoming statement from Dean Fu Hua Ling to the new law students this year. And it's worth reading. It's quite heartwarming. He really said, we're going to do our very best to preserve academic freedom in your legal education. And they posted it on the Hong Kong U Law Faculty Research website, and somebody pushed back with a comment saying, essentially, forget it. I know you're not going to talk about Tibet. You're not going to talk about this. You're not going to talk. And Fu Hualing answered and said, yes, I am. And if you want to audit my class, you can. And I really do think it's important to see they're in a rough position. And obviously academic freedom has decreased at Hong Kong U. You see what's happened to the student unions, what's likely to happen to the Pillar of Shame. It has decreased. The question is, how far will it go? And I think in terms of practical things, reinstating the Fulbright program would be nice. Sending articles to publish in Hong Kong journals and seeing if they get published is another thing that you can do. Inviting academics to come to visit in conferences when hopefully travel resumes. Going to conferences if you feel comfortable doing it. There's a lot of things that you can do so that Hong Kong academics don't feel like they've just been written off. And whenever I hear someone say, oh, Hong Kong's just another city in China now, I feel like it's a slap in the face to the academics, the journalists, the other people who are trying to preserve as much freedom of expression as they can. So that's what I would do practically.
Well, we shouldn't be writing off the academics in mainland China either. We should be engaging
That's
with
right.
them, I would argue.
I totally agree. I totally agree.
Very quick question. Lessons here from the Hong Kong experience for how the US should approach Taiwan?
Jerry, I've been talking a lot. How about you take that one?
I'm a great believer that we should not cross those lines that were agreed to by the United States with respect to not establishing formal diplomatic relations with Taiwan. But without, and also we also agreed to withdraw our military forces from Taiwan. I agree with the general policy now of demonstrating increasing support for Taiwan through a whole range of actions. But I do not think placing US military troops on Taiwan, as we recently have done, is correct. And I think we have to withdraw that. But I do think it's important that we show our support. I'd be in favor of having the Taipei Economic Office in the United States change its name to the Taiwan Representative Office. Lithuania has led the way on this. That's somewhat provocative, but it's not a violation of the understandings that began with the Shanghai Communique and then were formalized later, beginning 1979. So we want to show support for Taiwan increasing, so Beijing has no doubt that it can cost-free take over Taiwan by one means or another. On the other hand, we don't want to unnecessarily cross the red lines that Beijing has a right to object to. Placing military forces in Taiwan secretly initially goes too far, and that ought to be corrected. Similar question would be about naval port calls. I don't think that's just unnecessarily provocative. Well, there are many other actions that ought to be done to bolster US relations with Taiwan.
Well, we have to leave it there. We're at time. Thank you very much.
Can I just say one last thing? Taiwan has done a really good job of ratifying human rights treaties. And even though they're not allowed to do it formally with the UN, they've incorporated them into their domestic law. And I think that's something that we could highlight again and again and again, is what a success Taiwan's adherence to international human rights standards and democratic standards has been, so that we make it very clear there's a clear moral obligation, I think, to defend that.
In practice as well as in legislation.
Yes, they've held their own feet to that fire, yes. Thank you very much, Carole, for your wonderful presentation. Also, draw everybody's attention to the excellent essay that we published today on our website, Usali Perspectives essay by Carole, which sums up the argument that she's just been making. Jerry, thanks so much for your excellent questions, comments, facilitation, as always, and we hope to see everybody a week from today, Wednesday, at our usual time, 9 a.m. for a conversation about the South China Sea. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you. There's a whole lot of questions we didn't get to answer. If anybody wants to email me, please feel free. Thank you very much.